Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode here from Gwiglit, your YouTube channel for all things books, beards and beyond. Today we are continuing our series on Macbeth and the play Macbeth in its entirety. And today we look at the second half of Act 2, that's Act 2 scenes 3 and 4. But before we do, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and share this with all your friends and nearest loved ones. And give the bell icon a little tap to always find out when the next video is coming up. And if you haven't already, why not get involved with Gwiglit across the different social media channels. We're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, and we're on TikTok as well. All your support is greatly appreciated by myself, so thank you very much. Okay, as always, what can we do with the video? Well, I strongly encourage people to take notes as they watch along, pause, reflect, and take notes. I strongly encourage people to annotate their copy of the text, to use it as a revision tool, both by yourself or with fellow classmates where you have them. Mind maps as well is a great opportunity here, especially during this lockdown while I'm recording this, and to list examples. Always use this as a way of listing some really important examples from the two scenes. Now, before Act 2 scenes 3 and 4, we know that King Duncan has just been murdered. The only people before these scenes that know of this are the perpetrators, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. No one else at this point in the play is aware, and it's this part in the play where they start to become aware and the fallout really happens. Now Macbeth is tormented by his actions, but Lady Macbeth doesn't hear of it. She insists he must push on, and we see a very different approach by the two of them in their reactions, their public reactions to the other characters. So, a couple of things you need to know about Act 2, Scenes 3 and 4. Firstly, in Act 2, Scene 3, we notice how Macbeth is attempting to show this false face to the others. He's very blunt, very direct, and very dismissive of a lot of the claims and worries that the other characters have, whereas Lady Macbeth is more eloquent and puts on more of a very deliberate act. We also need to be aware that this scene starts with a comedy aspect in the Porter. Now, a lot of classes and a lot of teachers may not go over this scene, however, it has come up in examinations before, so this is the type of scene you don't want to ignore. Ignore at your own peril. The Porter makes one appearance in this entire play, and it's right here. It makes a lot of risque jokes about drunkenness, and it's used as a sense of comic relief. Whereas Act 2, Scene 4 is a short scene, a very short scene that underlines the changes in society that are happening now Duncan is dead, and we are seeing the beginning of the reign of Macbeth. So let's get straight into it. We start at Act 2, Scene 3, and as I said, we start with the Porter. To give you some context, this is very much after the party, in the early hours of the morning. The effects of drinking are very much commented on and joked upon here. So, the Porter's scene, as it is most commonly known, is a deliberate use of comic relief. So the audience has just been treated to a very heavy, very brutal description of murder and death and guilt and anguish. And as a consequence of that and a reflection upon that, what Shakespeare does here is uses this sense of comic relief, light-heartedness, jokes, to help the audience feel a lighter sense of what is about to happen. So it gives us a bit of a balance as an audience. So the Porter talks about being the Porter of Hellgate, imagining that the gates of Dunsinane are the gates of hell. So there's a joke going on here of the knocking. So if he was the gatekeeper of hell, who are the people that will be knocking? He comments on various people: a farmer that hanged himself on the expectation of plenty, an equivocator that could swear in both the scales, and an English tailor come here for stealing out of a French hose. So he's commenting on those that find themselves in hell by the expectations of a Jacobean society. Those that took their own lives, or liars and cheats, are the examples that he uses, as would have been seen in, remember, the contextual audience of the time would have related to that. So, he says about how I had thought to have let in some of all professions that go into the primrose way to the everlasting bonfire. Again here, there's some dramatic irony. He's comparing the gates of Dunsinane to the gates of hell, when Duncan's murder, probably the most evil, hellish act that could take place, has taken place. So there's a sense of dramatic irony there. So we have this scene of humour, and we also have this with the first entrance, and this is the first appearance of the character of Macduff. Macduff is often ignored and forgotten about prior to the banquet scene in Act 3. However, he's an important character to remember, particularly not only for what he does at the end of the play, but where he appears just now. So Macduff appears, and there is joking back and forth between Macduff and the Porter. The porter talks about how drink is a great provoker of three things, joking about the effects of alcohol for comic relief, and he talks in great detail here about nose painting, sleep and urine. The idea of drinkers having a kind of broken blood vessels across the nose was a common pictorial description of them. The idea that they fall asleep and need to go to the toilet often. Also talking about how drink provokes the desire but it takes away the performance. Here, the porter is making a number of very deliberate, often quite close to the bone jokes about the effects of drinking, that people become lecherous, that people will need to go to the toilet often, very kind of lowbrow jokes. Shakespeare isn't all about highbrow references to mythology, as we'll see later. It's about appealing to everybody. And these jokes bring up the light-heartedness of the play and restore the kind of equilibrium and balance of people's emotions as they have sensed after the murder of Duncan. So after this series of jokes, Macbeth enters, and we want to pay very close attention as this is Macbeth's first appearance since the murder of Duncan. Notice the way he responds to Macduff and the other characters. For example, notice how his first lines are "good morrow both, not yet." They're short and they're direct. It shows a sense of reservation because he obviously knows that in the chamber is Duncan dead. No one else does. So he's very much hiding his emotions at this point in the play. Whereas Macduff has a position of responsibility. We see here how he says, "He did command me to call timely on him." So Macduff is there in a position of responsibility. Now, notice how Macbeth does not go in with Macduff. He says, "This is the door." Shows in a way to the audience, there's a very subliminal hint here that Macduff going in alone shows how Macbeth is very much reserved and not wanting to see the act again. He can't bring himself to look upon the crime. Very telling response here. Now, we see here how the natural world has been impacted at the bottom by what Lennox talks to Macbeth. Says the night has been unruly, our chimneys were blown down, some say the earth was feverish and did shake. There's a real connotation and connection here between the death of Duncan and the death of the natural world and the destruction of the natural world. And in doing this, we see the events have a greater impact and significance on Shakespeare's Scotland that he presents. Notice how the death of Duncan means almost the death of the world. Now, as the scene continues, we see how Macbeth continues to hold firm on this very short, dismissive presentation. Macbeth's response is just direct and dismissive in this play. He doesn't get involved in what Lennox is talking about here, even though Lennox comments on how "my young remembrance cannot parallel a fellow to it." He contrasts with Macbeth's statement, whereas Macbeth is being dismissive, says, "Well, it's just a choppy night, it's a stormy night." Lennox says in all his life, as young as he is, he can't remember a time anything like it. Now we see not only Macbeth's contrasts with Lennox's presentation of the night, but we're going to now see, as an audience, Macduff's contrast with Macbeth's response to the murder of Duncan. Macduff has entered or re-entered from the chamber, has seen the dead body of Duncan, and notice his first words are, "Oh horror, 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 tongue nor heart cannot conceive nor name thee." We see this idea of fear and revulsion in Macduff's tone. He's very open, very explicit. The use of punctuation and exclamation marks showing that sense of fear and dismay and despair in Macduff's tone. Macduff continues to talk about how confusion now hath made his masterpiece the Lord's anointed temple and stole thence the life of the building. He begins to compare Duncan's body to the desecration of a holy temple, that in killing Duncan it has ruined this holy spectacle, and we see that Macduff is shocked and outraged and dismayed by this. When Lennox comments further, Macduff says, "Approach the chamber and destroy your sight with a new Gorgon." Macduff here is comparing the death of Duncan and the desecrated body of Duncan with mythology, the idea of the Gorgon, that which would turn, like Medusa, would turn one to stone. The significance of Duncan's murder here is really heightened in this comparison to a mythological character. As Macbeth and Lennox leave to go into the chamber and see the sight, we see Macduff continue in this impassioned speech, "Awake, awake, and look on death itself to countenance his horror." Macduff is the first character in this play that humanises the grief and despair that's felt in losing Duncan. Macbeth obviously can't do this because he's the perpetrator. However, this is the first of two, I would say, very clear contrasts with Macbeth in the sense of losing one and grief. Act 5, Scene 5 for Macbeth and Macduff's family being murdered is the second one, which we'll come to at a later video. So we really have a lot going on here. We see that Macduff is very shocked, very ashamed, terrified, devastated, whereas Macbeth is very much holding firm and reserving on his emotions. Lady Macbeth then enters, and she plays complete ignorance. She is more eloquent and refined in her acting here, whereas Macbeth is very hidden and very sheltered in what he's saying. Lady Macbeth is able to hold herself and express herself in a more refined and eloquent manner. So she pretends to feign all ignorance and wants to know what's happened. So Macduff, obviously knowing no better, falls entirely foolish by referring to her as gentle lady. The repetition in a woman's ear would murder as it fell. We see here that this perception of Lady Macbeth is extremely effective. In showing her false face, she has Macduff completely believing this. He's not the only character either. Gentle lady showing how diminutive she's perceived by the male characters at this point. Banquo then enters and is told. Lady Macbeth then says, "Woe, alas, what's in our house?" She's reinforcing here, wittingly or unwittingly, the treachery of the act. It was one thing to murder the king, but to murder the king in your own abode, in your own house where you're giving him protection, is the worst form of treachery that can possibly be seen here. And Lady Macbeth, knowingly or unknowingly, shows that. Now, Macbeth re-enters with Lennox and Ross and says, "Had I but died an hour before this chance, I'd lived the blessed time, for from this instant there's nothing serious in mortality." There are two ways the audience can read these lines from Macbeth. Now, the first one is the following. On the one hand, there is this outward expression of the grief that everyone feels at this point, this universal expression of grief that he says, "Had I died an hour before this chance, he'd lived a blessed time." To see the murdered, butchered body of Duncan is to ruin him in himself. However, what he also says, and we can see as an audience that knows more, and there's this sense of dramatic irony, he's saying here almost a sort of subliminal hint at his doom and damnation, saying here that had he died an hour before this chance being the chance of seeing the body, or chance being the opportunity to murder Macbeth's king Duncan. We have to think about it in that way as well. Maybe it's a comment instead on the loss of his soul, that he'd lived a blessed time if he'd died an hour before killing Duncan, as much as seeing Duncan's dead body. Now, when Malcolm and Donalbain enter, we see a very different perception in the way that they are told. On the one hand, Macbeth says how the spring, the head, the fountain of your blood is stopped, and the very source of it is stopped. Whereas Macduff comes straight out and says your royal father's murdered. I will always say here to my class that there's a contrast of descriptions. Macbeth can't bring himself to say the actual act, so he uses more metaphorical, poetic, cold terminology that sort of skirts around the issue. Macduff comes straight out, however, and is more human and brutal and emotional in what he's saying. So there's a real, again, an inability by Macbeth to fully countenance and fully acknowledge what he's done. And we see this difference yet again, as we will continue to see in the play, of Macduff and Macbeth showing very different responses to grief and loss. Now, Malcolm asks who's done it, and Lennox claims that those of his chamber, as it seemed, had done it. Their hands and faces were badged with blood. So it appears to Lennox and a bystander that the guards have been framed for the crime, that the plan itself has worked as it should have done for Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. Now, Macbeth has actually come out and said that, "Oh, yet I do repent me my fury that I did kill them," the guards. Macbeth has actually gone one step further and has silenced the guards entirely by murdering them. When Macduff asks why he did this, his argument is the expedition my violent love outrun the paws of reason, and that who could refrain that had a heart to love, and in that heart courage to make loves known. His excuse is that he's done this, and it is an act that is done out of love and passion, that love and passion give way to rage at the murder of Duncan, and in doing so kills them. However, remember, as an audience, we know he committed the crime, so in doing this, he's created the perfect way of getting away with the crime. what he's done here is killed the only two people that could possibly argue their defence. So now they're dead, they can't argue their defence, and they are the ones that are seen to have done the crime. Lady Macbeth then pretends to faint, and this is completely believed by Macduff and Banquo, who both say look to the lady, which we'll come on to soon. However, Malcolm and Donalbain are completely stunned. They're in shock. Let's away, our tears are not yet brewed. Why do we hold our tongues that most may claim this argument for ours? They don't know what's happened. They don't know what's going on here, and they are completely shocked and stunned in doing so. Now, as I said before, Macduff and Banquo are completely believing the act here. They both say look to the lady, and Lady Macbeth is carried out pretending to faint here. Now, I've always believed that she pretends to faint rather than actually faints, because she talks so often and so explicitly about the idea of the false face, about hiding one's emotions, that I don't believe it could actually be anything else. So, Banquo then says that they should meet and question this most bloody piece of work to know it further. In the great hand of God I stand. Here Banquo urges caution and reason that, this may not be all it seems, and they seek to find out more on the act itself. Banquo again being the foil to Macbeth here, showing reason and caution, where Macbeth shows anger and passion and fury. Macbeth agrees to this, and he talks about meeting in the hall together, and they all leave with the exception of Malcolm and Donalbain. Malcolm says that they should not consort with them, and to show an unfelt sorrow is an office which the false man does easy. They don't trust them, and they fear for their lives. Malcolm will go to England and Donalbain to Ireland to separate themselves, and to keep their safety it'd be harder to track both of them. This idea here of there's daggers in men's smiles, the near in blood, the nearer bloody. They fear that there's danger in their lives, and that whomever murdered Duncan will soon be looking to murder them, so they need to flee quickly, because the murderous shaft that shot hath not yet lighted. They want to flee while there's still time. So Malcolm and Donalbain flee, and are not to be seen again until the end of Act 4, leaving a power vacuum in Scotland. Duncan's gone, is murdered, Malcolm, the nearest heir, and his brother are both gone, so there is a completely empty seat that Macbeth can quite easily take. Now we go into scene 4, a very small scene here. We see Ross enter, a minor character with an even more minor character in the old man. This scene is intended to allow the plot to progress. There's a sense of exposition here that we are being told about the coronation of Macbeth is the main thing that occurs. This old man is seen as a symbol of wisdom, the idea of history and the human history of Scotland. And the old man begins by saying 70, so 70 years I can remember well. But this sore night hath trifled former knowings. The old man here comments on how the events of that night are unlike anything he has ever felt. There is a real sense of this being an epochal moment in Scotland's history, that this fundamentally changes everything. And Ross and the old man contemplate this and comment to each other. Ross comments how the heavens seem troubled with man's act, that mankind is damaging the very heavens itself. Remember, Duncan is the representation in human form of God, so to murder Duncan is almost to murder God. The idea of dark night strangles the travelling lamp, that the weather is entering, as well as Scotland is entering this new era of darkness, that there is a foreboding sense in Scotland after the murder of Duncan. In addition, the old man comments on how a falcon last Tuesday was towering in her pride of place, killed by a mousing owl, hawked and killed. There's a metaphorical representation here and a nod to the regicide that's done to Duncan. That Duncan, this falcon towering in its place of pride, and Macbeth, this mousing owl, a far lower animal on the spectrum, has usurped it and killed it, which is deeply unnatural given the circumstances. In addition, Ross comments how Duncan's horses turned wild with nature, and how the old man adds to this saying they ate each other, or they eat each other, that nature itself has completely lost its understanding of the way it goes, and Duncan's horses are very much destroyed as a result. That nature is turned feverous, and the world is very much almost turning in on itself and giving way to evil. Macduff then enters, and he's asked about how things are going, and Macduff asks, why see you not? That he is despairing at the state of the world as much as Ross and the old man are. He then confirms how those that Macbeth has slain have been convicted of the crime. They were suborned by Malcolm and Donalbain. It's believed the king's two sons have suspicion of the deed. So inadvertently, in Malcolm and Donalbain fleeing, not only do Macbeth and Lady Macbeth get away with the crime, but the soldiers are believed to have acted for Malcolm and Donalbain. They are believed to have been agents for the sons to kill their father. So it actually puts the place and the onus of guilt and responsibility upon them, which is important in itself. Now Macduff comments and confirms how Macbeth is already named, has gone to Scone to be invested, the holy seat of Scotland at the time. So Macbeth has now been named king, he has got away with the crime completely, and the guilt is on the sons of Duncan. Ross comments on how if Macduff will attend the ceremony, and Macduff will not attend Macbeth's coronation. There's a little minor point here, but I think it's of great importance in the overall scheme of things. Macduff is distancing himself from Macbeth. He does not go on to comment on why he's distancing himself from Macbeth in any great detail, but what he does do, and what he does say, is quite explicit in his separation from Macbeth. And then we have the end of the scene where the old man says, "God's benison, God's blessing go with you, and with those that will make good of bad and friends of foes." So there is a fear for the future of Scotland after Duncan's death. The old man ending there on this point just before Macbeth returns as the King of Scotland shows that there is a real sense of fear and dismay in how Scotland will go forward under King Macbeth. So that's been the end of Act 2. Thank you very much as always for tuning in. It means the absolute world to me. Don't forget to follow on Instagram, Twitter and TikTok. Like, share and subscribe if you enjoyed this video as well. Share it with your friends and anybody studying at the moment. And until next time, take care, all the very best, and bye-bye.